Really appreciate for those of you that are in the room for coming out, and those of you that are online attending digitally or on a web form. I appreciate that. We have a great panel of speakers here today, and we're talking about transportation technology. And we have technologies that are unfolding that are really going to transform how we travel and how we're able to travel. And there are a lot of exciting technologies that are unfolding. And as a long-range planning organization, we really have a responsibility to sort of gaze into that crystal ball and look out into the future and try to imagine 10, 20, 25 years down the road, because the decisions that we are making now will impact our position as we head into that future that is unfolding. So Eve McMenemy is our Deputy Director, and Eve has assembled this panel and she's leading the conversation today. So I'm going to turn it over to Eve, and she's going to give it a little housekeeping and then start the show.
Thank you everyone for coming, really appreciate it. Just a few logistics, restrooms right outside here, emergency exits, back door there's your first exit where you can trace your step back the way you came in. Please sign in. If you haven't, we'd like to have just a record of who's available and who's here today. And also we're encouraging questions throughout this discussion. So I'll be stopping periodically for Q&A. We'll get a microphone out to you folks if you have a question. And if you're attending via the webinar, please put your questions in the question and answer chat there, and we'll have some staff monitoring that for you as well. So with that, Jason, I'd just like you to get to the next slide for me, which is the purpose of what we're doing here today. So this is part of our transportation discussion series. The series is really designed for us all to take a deeper dive into transportation issues. This is our 8th installment on technology. And we all want to collectively have a better understanding of the opportunities ahead of us. And Lois alluded to that. We're trying to identify strategies through these conversations, whether they be identifying new policies that we might need, or new planning activities, or refining our criteria. So things to help us advance technology. And specifically today, we're going to learn about understanding the benefits technology can provide, and what technology is coming in the near future, and how do we best prepare the region for that. So if you're interested in any of the discussion series, it's available on our website, srtc.org, and feel free to share today's presentation, which will be available next week, to any of your friends or family. Next slide, Jason. So I'd like to mention SRTC's roles and responsibility related to technology. So for those of you who aren't aware, we are the Metropolitan Planning Organization for this region. The board, as Lois alluded to, has the responsibility for long-range planning and to have our eyes on the future and develop some strategic direction for our regional improvements and our regional investments. And Horizon 2045 is our long-range plan. That's approved by our board, and it outlines the strategic direction that is financially achievable in the next 20 years. The agency also has an important relationship with another regional agency, which is the Transportation Management Center. And we have been a longtime funding partner of the Management Center. Their job is to manage the day-to-day operations on the interstate. As you see there in the picture, there's a operator there watching what's going on. They provide communications to travelers. They provide communications to emergency response. And they also coordinate complex technological solutions with folks that are in this room, our member agencies. It's very important we share our resources and share our knowledge when it comes to technology, because it is complex and it can be expensive, and that helps us keep our costs down. The TMC also does another thing. They write the architecture plan. I know I'm talking about a lot of plans here. And the purpose of that architecture plan, it's a deep dive into technology and how we're going to use it in the region, who's responsible for it, and how do we use it in a cohesive way. And the SRTC board is also responsible for approving that plan. So as you can see, SRTC has considerable responsibilities in this area, and really the intent is to maximize the benefits. So what are some of those benefits of technology? And I'm just going to touch on some because these very distinguished panelists here will tell you more today. But no matter who we are, we have to get from place to place, and our goods need to get from place to place. And many of you have probably already experienced this, but technology really improves efficiency. It improves efficiency of freight delivery, allowing you to change your trip on the fly with your phone. Matt's giving me a thumbs up back there. And also reducing the need and cost for more infrastructure, which is important to us. And these are quickly becoming standard tools that we're adapting to. Technology also can improve safety. Some of you might already have a vehicle that prevents you from hitting a pedestrian or drifting out of your lane, or notifying you of an upcoming train crossing or a signal change. Those are new technologies. And also technology helps with the environment by reducing pollution as we switch to cleaner and greener sources of energy, or eliminating the trip need for all, as demonstrated by the folks that are joining us here virtually today. So with that, as the panelists talk today, I want you to be thinking about these short-term and long-term opportunities, and keep in mind they can maximize the use of what we've built now, and they can also improve our quality of life, which is why they're so important. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. They bring local, state, and national perspective to our conversation today. I hope you've had your chance to read their lengthy bios. They each have significant experience in the technology space, from developing policy right down to implementing technology on our roadways. So farthest from me is Randy Iwasaki. He is the leader of state and local transportation for Amazon Web Services. And his previous experience includes director of Caltrans, which is the California DOT. And he comes from us today from Northern California. So thank you, Randy. Adrian Piermine is next. He is the National Director for Smart Cities and Connected Vehicles at DTS Associates. And Adrian is here today from Portland, Oregon. Rima Griffith in the pink is the Executive Director of the Washington State Transportation Commission. And Rima is here today from Olympia. And finally, our local representative from Spokane, Glenn Wagaman, go Zags, Transportation Engineering Manager for the Washington State DOT right here in the Eastern region. So with that, I'm going to dive into our first question, which I'm going to address to Glenn and then to Rima. And that is, can you talk a little bit about successful applications of transportation technology in the region and the state today, why they are beneficial, and what else should we expect soon?
Wow, that's a tough question. So I made notes so that I wouldn't take up the full hour and a half, because I can do that. So let me start with some of the things that we've done here. I'm going to start with low-hanging fruit. I'm just going to kind of build on it. So one of the things that you may or may not think about are smart work zones. So we have work zones now that we've deployed that monitor and give advance notice or warning to drivers in the field. So if a queue starts to build, we can give them an advance notice, a half mile, a mile beforehand. We can tell them what speeds are. We also are using that technology to make the inspectors and those in the work zone safer. So we have alerts that go off for those workers that are in the work zone. And so an errant vehicle coming in is no longer an errant vehicle, because now we have eyes and ears through an alert. I'm going to jump over connected and automated transportation for a second. But one of the things that we are looking at here and is deployed in our Southwest region in Vancouver is wrong way detection. And you say, well, what do you need wrong way detection for? So in 2018, we did a study. We had 9 fatalities between SR 904 and the state line. 9 fatalities, too many, associated with wrong way drivers. So where do they get on? I don't know, because when the accident happens, they're 3 or 4 miles from where they got on, and sometimes they don't remember. Most of the times they don't remember. So these are devices that will detect the vehicle moving in the wrong direction, send a message to an activated sign that gets the driver. Hopefully they self-correct, but that also sends a message to our transportation management center, and they're notified, and also puts a message up on the message board to those drivers going in the correct direction that doesn't tell them what to do, but it makes them aware of somebody going in the wrong direction. So we have 2 locations, but we're still studying those to see if they are the locations where we're having some of these problems. Connected, automated transportation, that's what we call it at WashDOT. We don't want to call it autonomous vehicles or anything else, but our roadways are being used for A/B testing. So we have vehicles out there, companies out there that have gone through the process. They're out testing on our roadways. We have platoon trucks. I-90 through a certain portion is part of a national system for truck testing. In Spokane here, how many of you knew that we had a corridor that was set up for connected vehicles? Okay, so I presented to some of you back when, and that corridor no longer exists. And you say, well, why doesn't it exist? And that's because industry has moved to 5G solely. So we had what was called DSRC, dedicated short range communications. And so your vehicle, if you had the right vehicle, could receive the information from the signal, know what timing that signal was on, as far as like if you were stopped at it, what the countdown time was going to be, those kind of things. However, industry moved to 5G, so those devices, while they still could be used, are not the direction of the industry. But that was on SR27 Pines from Sprague Avenue to Mission, just before you get to I-90. But one of the biggest things that you've probably seen around here, and it's not new technology, it's old technology, but it's the ramp meters. But how we're operating in Spokane is what the difference is. And so we activated those meters first, not for congestion, but for collision reduction. And we know that ramp meters will help with that, but our focus was, we know we'll get the secondary benefit, which is huge for the congestion, but our goal was to reduce those collisions. And so let me give you a couple statistics. So the first ramp meter was US 195, started in 2019, April of 2019. Since that time frame, we've had a 63% reduction in the collisions that happen at that merge point. If you would have asked me to put down money, I would have never got to that number. I would have said, if we got to 30%, I would have been dancing. But we got to 63%, and that's being sustained. So that's a good thing. These are early results, so don't go quoting them because they're not statistically valid. But we turned on 5 additional ramp meters in 2021, April of 2021. And the ramp meter that we're most concerned about is the eastbound Walnut on-ramp. The merge up top is 250 feet. So if you're not paying attention, you're not accelerating, it can be challenging. And so in 2021, that's the most current data we have. We don't have data into 2022 yet. But when we look at the 2021 data, what we see is that there were a total for the year of 8 collisions associated with that merge point. 4 of those 8 happened in the months of January, February, and March. Okay, so we've already eliminated half of those. We turned on the ramp meter in April, and we had 4 in the remaining 9 months. Of those 4, 3 of them is when the ramp meter was operating. The other was when there was snow and ice. So when you look at that, the average for the last 5 years was 22 collisions per year at that location. So we've gone at least from 22 down to this, we'll call it 8, but it's not a statistically valid number. You know, we're just beginning to look at that. And then the other thing is real-time, operational assessments and implementation. So you're going to hear me talk a little bit more in another question about data gathering. But when we talk about the benefits of technology, here's what I see from my seat sitting in my wonderful office that my regional administrator has given me to work out of. The world looks like this. I can look at the whole network, and that whole network has capacity. So the system is not full. It's a matter of how we operate it and how we choose to drive and what modes we use. And so technology helps us operate that network smarter and more efficient. And so not every trip has to be get on I-90, travel 1 mile, and get off at the next interchange. For example, none of you do this. Get on at Walnut and get off at Division eastbound. I know you don't, and I won't poll you. We see a large percentage of what comes on at Walnut gets off at Division because they just want to go around the surface street. Higher speed collision, timing, yeah, maybe you get there quicker, but your stress level's up. So it can help us with that. ITS technology and the data from it helps us make informed investments and decision. Without data, how do you know what's going on? You can set a device out there to collect data, but it's a point in time. We have invested in devices that are collecting data all the time to allow us to make real-time operational decisions and to say, we need to invest here or here. And then the last thing I'll say is that ITS technology, it serves as the backbone to delivering what I like to call it. Now, this is my term, Okay, so this is my term, what I like to call safe and smart complete streets. To me, a street is not complete unless it has a smart component to it. And that's not for the cars, but that's for all. So it could be a pedestrian countdown timer that is tied to STA's network or tied to STA in the sense of the bus waiting time. But just adding the sidewalk, if we're going to open it up, it needs to be a smart, complete street as we open up that network.
So kind of bringing that up now to the state level, and looking forward into the future, since, anyone at the state level and above has crystal balls in their offices. They're very clear. But I think the way we're preparing for transportation of the future, in Washington State, and I think nationally where the discussion's heading, is around this vision of what we call ACEs, which is autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And with those 4 pillars, we tend to focus, or we are focusing on our planning efforts and our investments, honestly, at the legislative level, to start enabling the achievement of that over time across the state. And I say this for rural and urban. It's more popular in urban areas, but the commission is always a very strong voice to reminding our lawmakers of the needs in our rural areas of the state that actually need much bigger investments to get them caught up as we think about a statewide network of bases. On the autonomous front, the commission is leading an autonomous vehicle work group that the legislature directed, and it will sunset at the end of 2023. So it's been in place since 2018. And they have been working to prepare and advise the legislature through the commission on how the things we need to do to prepare for autonomous vehicles in operation on our public highways. What does that look like? What does that mean? How do we not over legislate and suppress innovation? But how do we keep the public safety at the forefront of this transition? What do we need to think about in lawmaking and regulations around a mixed fleet notion, which will be around for a long time? Not everybody's going to be in an autonomous car. And what does it mean on the upside for transit and redefining transit and multimodal approaches to transportation? And how does it affect the workforce and how our culture is the fabric of our culture is going to change in this world that may emerge where you don't need a driver in a vehicle, right? It'll be able to do a lot more and enable a lot of people that today maybe can't drive. But it also calls into question the role of the driver. And what is our role? And should we even own cars at that point, right? So I think the other question that follows the autonomy assessment is, what does this changing world around auto ownership look like? And when we look at the automakers, and we see discussions around, for example, subscription services, where maybe someday I don't buy a car, maybe I buy a subscription through a particular automaker, and that entitles me to using a certain kind of car a certain time of the year for a certain amount of time. Maybe I don't need a car all the time. And what COVID showed us is that maybe I don't need to drive to work all the time, if at all. These are great from a technology standpoint. They're horrible from a revenue standpoint. I'll get to that later. But people are driving less. We have a problem in terms of our funding structure. So I think from the autonomy, we're doing our best to prepare for something that isn't here yet, and trying to help the legislature create some foundational laws that are a launching point as the evolution of this sector emerges. On the connected side, it's all about what we just heard about, connecting the technology in cars and our smartphones with our infrastructure and making it seamless so that they can talk to each other and they can make the driving experience more efficient and more safe. These take big investments in roadside infrastructure, in 5G with our partners in the private sector, and connecting those dots so that we can empower and accelerate the use of these technologies in our day-to-day driving, whether it's giving us congestion reports in real time on our car while we're going down the highway, to advising us on alternative routes, just like everybody else, and everybody gets on the same local street. But those technologies are important, and the connectivity is what's going to enable that to accelerate. So those investments need to happen continually over time. Autonomous, connected, electric. So electric vehicles, we had an interesting discussion this morning around what are electric vehicles really going to be the thing? I mean, if we contemplate the entire US moving to electricity and using that as the power for vehicles, can our grid handle it? Will it be there? Will the capacity be there? There's other technologies and developments in hydrogen fuel cell. and other approaches to fueling vehicles. So while we say electric, I think what we're really trying to say is climate-friendly alternative fuel sources that are going to move our vehicles so that we, as we continue to drive, we're also not damaging the environment as we have been doing historically with fossil fuels. And lastly, on the shared front, we are paying attention to partnering with and supporting the advancement of what we mean by shared. That is largely a private sector provision. Uber and Lyft today, which is a lot of us use. But when we think of the future, what we're really thinking about is mobility as a service. It's called MOS, is an acronym, but what we're getting at here again is this notion of sharing to the next level. Sharing, you may have heard of Turo, which is a very popular car rental app that's emerged on the market that is now kind of flipping on its head the car rental market and what it means to use a car. And maybe I've got a spare car in my garage, I'm going to go ahead and rent out. It's starting to make us rethink those paradigms we've lived with historically and challenge them about what it means to share. We just heard from a company who just launched in Las Vegas, and they'll soon be coming to Bellevue, that delivers shared vehicles autonomously, and not really autonomously. It's got a remote car, a driver in a room that looks like a video game, and he's driving the car, but when you see it on the street, there's no driver in it. And he's driving the vehicle to the person who just rented or reserved that vehicle for whatever, a day or two, or maybe it's just a couple hours. The car arrives, then the driver gets in and drives it. When they're done, they just park it, and the company remotely drives the car back to its base. They're trying to use only electric vehicles, and they're trying to change again the thought process around car ownership and what I need to be mobile when I need to be mobile. So when we think about shared, that's where we're seeing industry heading, and we know there's going to be a lot more great, even things we don't know about yet. But those four pillars combined kind of start painting the picture of transportation and how we think about it going into the future.
Thanks, Rima. It's good to know what's going on in Washington State. It's good stuff. I'm going to turn it over to Adrian and also Randy to give us more of a national perspective of what initiatives are going on and how they're moving forward and timeframes on how these changes, how quickly they might be coming. So Adrian, you had a few slides, and we're going to get them up here for you. The floor is yours.
Are you able to put it into slide mode?
Take it out of presentation. Yours.
It's not.
Yeah. Jason's slide looks great.
Yeah.
There we go.
So I'm going to talk about what we affectionately call the third revolution of mobility, and that was everything Rima was just talking about: connected, automated, shared, electric. So let's go to the next slide. So this is, in fact, we're not even talking about the future of transportation. We're really changing the paradigm a little bit to mobility. How do we get ourselves and our packages and whatever else from point A to point B? So next slide. So what is this third revolution about? Next slide. So we'll actually talk about the first two revolutions that we've gone through as sort of mobility industry. So we started walking, and horse and buggy was kind of the first revolution or first era of transportation and mobility. Next slide. Yep, next slide. And so the first revolution was this movement from horse and buggy to the car. So how quickly did this happen as a society? So using this image, this is the Easter Day parades in New York City, and I'm starting to see this slide and this presentation used a lot. I know I stole it from somebody a few years back, and people are stealing it from me. But in 1900, there was one automobile, and every other vehicle in that picture was a horse and buggy. 13 years later, it was flipped around, where every automobile was an automobile, and there's one horse and buggy. So that's less than 15 years we went through that rapid of a transition of how we get from point A to point B. Let's go to the next slide. Second revolution was the building out of our highway and freeway system. If you want to build something this big, this fast, use defense money. So this was our Defense Interstate and Defense Highways Act. And there's a reason that the overpasses are a certain elevation they are. It's so that we could move missiles underneath them. We built that out very quickly. And what does that look like across our country? Let's go to the next slide. In some cases, maybe it wasn't really thinking very much about the people that lived in those communities. It was thinking about how do we move vehicles from point A to point B as quickly as we can. Let's go to the next slide. So the third revolution, and I'll start to plant a seed here. We'll come back to this in some of the other conversations. In those first two revolutions, they happened very quickly. They drastically transformed the way that people get from point A to point B. And we began designing our cities and our communities around the technology. We designed them around the car, and we were trying to move people as quickly as we could. And we've been undoing a lot of damage in a lot of ways because if you think about the neighborhoods that were bulldozed to build those freeways, and you think about some of the other decisions that have been made, there's been enormous equity impacts on these first two revolutions. So as we enter this third revolution, it's not that kind of revolution, it's the ACES revolution that we were talking about. And really, it's not any one of these things independently. It's not connected only or autonomous only or electric. It's the convergence of these four that are going to drastically change the way that people get from point A to point B. And Rick was talking a lot about this with mobility as a service and the ability to say, I want to start my trip here and I want to end my trip there. What are my different options? So I don't have to have a car. I can take a scooter from here to here. I can take the bus from point A to point B, and then I can get an Uber or Lyft for that last 2 miles. I like that option today. That works for me. And being able to pick off of that menu of choices, the mobility choice that makes the most sense is the convergence opportunity within all of this. So I'm going to focus a little bit because we talk a lot about connected and autonomous, but those of us that spend all our lives in the space kind of know what it means, but we don't communicate it very well. So I'm going to try to describe both the relationship and the difference between the connected and the automated pieces of this. So connected vehicles may be autonomous vehicles, or they may just be any car that has very or little to no automation whatsoever. It's just the ability to communicate with one another and the ability to communicate with our infrastructure. It might not have any automation. It's just informing the driver what's going on. Autonomous is when we get there eventually, and levels of automation will get us there eventually, will be the self-driving piece of this. Let's go to the next slide. So what does connected mean? We tend to break it down to what we call V2V. Got to get some acronyms in here, but we'll describe them. Vehicle to vehicle communication. And that has to happen like 10 times a second. I have to know that that car's got its turn signal on, and they're intending to come into my lane, but I can't see them. They're in my blind spot. Or the car knows that it sensed the pedestrian in the driveway, and it can tell the cars are in the crosswalk, can tell cars behind it. V to I, or vehicle to infrastructure, is the communication to what used to be dedicated short range communication is now connected vehicle to everything technology, or just using the cellular network for the vehicles to talk back to our infrastructure. Next slide. Oh yeah, that's basically what I was saying. So it can either be talking to one another directly to infrastructure or over the cellular network. And this and concept has taken us a long time. As an industry, we're focused for way too long on vehicles communicating with some local radio in the infrastructure and not looking at the opportunities that cellular really brings here. And we're finally grasping that we're never going to build out a network of radios along every 1,000 feet of every piece of roadway. It just doesn't make any sense. So if we're not partnering with private sector cell industry to bring that piece, we're never going to get there. Next slide. So let's talk about the automation and autonomous part. And part of the reason I bring up this slide is we have a tendency to think about that picture in the middle, the white thing that looks like a normal sedan that just has a bunch of technology strapped onto it. But we really need to be thinking about the automation of all of the different types of vehicle form factors, delivering packages and vehicles. And that's important at the state level and at planning level, to not accidentally only be thinking about one or two of these applications and be setting policy or engineering decisions or other things that make the other ones not work very well, or not work at all, or illegal or something. So we want to keep all of that in mind. Let's go to the next slide. So how does this work? I'm going to do a very complex, how it really works is very complex. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. There's GPS and there's a onboard computer with high resolution mapping. So the vehicle knows where it is, knows it should be in this lane, and then a suite of sensors around that vehicle saying, yep, I'm in the lane that I think I am, and I'm that far away from that white line, and there's something I didn't expect to be ahead, pedestrian, bike, box, something else. So it's that combination of those main components. Let's go to the next slide. Creating this sort of visual bubble around a certain amount of the car. It can only see what those sensors can see. So let's go to the next slide. And so as I mentioned earlier, if we know the analogy that a square is always a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't necessarily a square. Let's go to the next slide. The connected vehicles right now, or automated vehicles right now, are being built in a lot of cases with very little connectivity. They're being built just so they see what's around their little bubble. And that's what our auto manufacturers and their tier one providers. And it's our job from a policy perspective to say, you know what, you got to get that connected component into this. Let's go to the next slide. So we want all autonomous vehicles to be autonomous, automated, whatever level you're at, and connected. We want that to be a square and a rectangle. Next slide. I'm not going to run the video today. I've got a couple different slides, but this was an old one that Tesla put out. It's really pretty fascinating to be looking over somebody's shoulder and watch the vehicle drive down the road and go around a construction zone and around corners, and then see what the computer is looking at, that situational awareness piece of all of it. It's pretty fascinating. Next slide. And so that's what the situational awareness is doing. It's looking the same. I classify that as a car. I classify that as a person, bike. Next slide. But again, when it's only looking around what it can see in that bubble, it's never going to see that pedestrian in the crosswalk until it gets right there. But that connectivity piece of it, if our intersection knows that there's a pedestrian in the crosswalk and can tell that car whether a human is driving it and it gives you an alert, or whether the computer needs to know that. That's why we need this combination of connected and autonomous. Next slide. So the video on the left, again, we're not going to run it just due to time. Is a Tesla, is the vehicle right ahead of that. You're looking out the windshield of this Tesla, and it's cruising down the freeway, and it misses the fact that there's a work zone ahead sign because it's blocked by a truck. And I don't know if the Tesla would recognize work zone ahead anyway. And then all of a sudden there's a concrete barrier in the middle of the road, and it just slams into that barrier. Now, if they had a connected work zone, like Len was talking about, that Tesla would have known way back when, I want to get in the right-hand lane. And then the sensors would just confirm what it was already expecting. But since the Tesla doesn't have the connectivity piece, it slams into the concrete. And then the one on the right, I think this is from Ford, and it shows a couple different use cases of a pedestrian stepping right out from behind that semi truck, or some other examples of what their vision of this connected autonomous. And so my soapbox issue has been, let's put the C back in CAP. Next slide. But for a very long time, I mean, for the next few decades, I think, at least next couple decades, we're going to have a combination of vehicles that have little to no automation or little to no connectivity, and vehicles that are having increasing levels of both. So we've got to be designing our infrastructure to address both the human driver and the connected and the eventual levels of automation. So that's what, when you're talking about long-range planning, this is the kind of stuff we think about. Next slide. I'm hoping this is the end. And so what we can be doing at the city level and state when you're operating arterials or whatever is having passive detection that is identifying there's pedestrians, there's bikes, there's other things, and sending that message to the connected vehicle. So we need to be thinking about all these different pieces. So I think I'm done for.
Thanks, Adrian. I appreciate it. I'd like to hear Randy's perspective, working in the private sector and an ex-public sector. So go ahead, Randy.
Thank you again for the invitation. Committee, call your board members, commissioners. Board members, it's good to see you, directors, wherever you are. Thank you again for the invitation. So my role here is, and I imagine a person that has multiple personalities. That's how I'm going to be that today. I don't have multiple personalities, but I have multiple kind of approaches to this question about what to expect from technology. So I used to work at Caltrans. Caltrans ran the first automated driving system, automated highway system demonstration in the world with self-driving vehicles. This was back in the late 80s, early 90s. So it culminated with the test on I-15 in San Diego. We had a great research program, great partnership with General Motors and other companies. The whole idea was trying to figure out how to save lives. And so it's all about safety. How do you save lives? And we've all been in touch with people that are loved ones that have passed away for a number of different reasons. But in my opinion, roadway crashes can be avoided with technology today. So let me just start out by saying that. So I come from a Caltrans public sector, 27 years, and I work for the Contra Costa Transportation Authority. They represent Contra Costa County in California, 25 counties out of 58 use sales tax to fund transportation, which funds projects and programs. And so when I went to work, my board members, I had 11 of them. How many of you guys have? 20. So I had, oh wow. 20. So I had 11 board members, 3 ex officio, 14 total. And they really wanted to modernize the county. And so the first thing we did is we created the largest secure autonomous vehicle test bed in the United States. Momentum Station, which MEMA brought her board, and Oregon DOT brought their Oregon Transportation Commission. And my commission, when I worked at Caltrans, California Transportation Commission, and we gave them a glimpse of the future, much like what Adrian tried to do. And because I think it's important, and one of the questions that I was asked that we're going to answer in the future is, what can a planning agency do? What can an NPO do? And I was saying that proper planning, great planning equals great projects. If you do poor planning, you're going to work on the wrong projects, and they take so long to deliver. So as far as innovation, so ACES was talked about, so I'm not going to that, but robots. So we tested robot delivery on sidewalks. And it's not the same getting a pizza when it's delivered to you and you open the box, you smell it, and pay the person $20, whatever it costs for a pizza, and you give them a tip. You got to walk out to this curbside, put your code in, lift the top up, and then pick your pizza out. It's just not the same. But robot deliveries, drone deliveries, you can expect that in the future. And where planning comes into play is they're not going to drop down on the roadway here, nor on the freeway. They're going to drop down probably on the top of a building somewhere. So if you're thinking in terms of drone delivery, now's the time to begin to think about that. So that's what we started doing. We're also testing dynamic personalized microtransit, so on-demand delivery, first and last mile delivery. We were the first agency in North America to import those upside down toasters. We imported 2 easy mile shuttles through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, got the first 2 waivers from Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards because they're too heavy, and got the first 2 approvals in California to operate a no driver, no steering wheel, no brake pedal mechanism, or a robot or delivery ban on public streets. And we were second because Las Vegas beat us to the punch, but 2 hours after they cut the ribbon, they got backed into by a truck. And our at CCTA, ours are still traveling in San Ramon, California today. So first and last delivery. The last thing I'll talk about, because I only have a few minutes here, but adaptive technology. So Glenn talked about ramp meters. You're going to change the way you approach ramp metering in the future because it does save lives, it does save crashes because the platooning effect is minimized because you just send 1 or 2 vehicles out. But ultimately, your entire grid here is going to have to be adaptive because if you think about self-driving vehicles in a mixture, we care about the signal in front of you. You all say, hey, that signal is green or it's red or it's yellow, and you do the appropriate action. In the future, if you're in a self-driving vehicle, it's going to take you from point A to point B. It wants to know what the network is doing to get you the fastest way through your Spokane here. So that's going to be a big issue for you. And you need to start planning for that in the future. And so there's a lot more robotics. There's going to be a lot more drone delivery. And there's going to be a lot more kind of technology requirements. And so now I'm switching hats to AWS. We have technology. So most of the cameras that Glenn, you have in the infrastructure just see things. You turn those, pan, tilt, and zoom. It doesn't tell you there's something out there. And so we've developed a technology called Panorama, which is an edge device that takes a direct feed off that camera. You run a model, it looks for wrong way drivers. It looks for me because I'm getting so old now. It takes me a long time to walk across the intersection. The camera's looking at me going, oh, that's Randy Usaki, he's walking really slow. You hold the green for me. Why? Because I want to walk, I want to get exercise. But a lot of times if you're walking too slowly, that green light is going to turn yellow and turn red and you panic. And we do not want you to do that. So that's Panorama with 5G technology. The NFL uses our private 5G network to make sure that the head coach can talk to the box while you're tweeting the Super Bowl pictures to your family. And there's 65,000 of you they want to make sure that communication works. We're trying to use that to offload. You have a transit system here, right? So they have a lot of cameras. They wait till they go home at night to offload that video. They can't offload it real time because it's got latency issues. And so we're looking at how do we offload video for this, in Los Angeles, they're gonna hold this thing called the Olympics in 2028. And so we're working with LA Metro to try to figure out how do you offload that video, analyze it real time, and make sure the customers, you all, get from one venue to the other on time so you can watch the various events there. And then lastly, it's, you talked about edge, or you talked about low latency, or we got a lot of different edge kind of computing devices and containers that can help rural parts of America make sure that you've got adequate curb warning. So that you're driving 85 miles an hour around a curve and it says it's only 65, it'll warn you that you're going too fast, try to slow down your vehicle. And so I think these are some of the cool things that are coming up that are going to help areas like this.
Thank you, Randy. Appreciate it. All right, time for a little Q&A. Does anyone in the room have a question they would like to ask? All right, I think David's monitoring something.
Yeah, we have a couple online. So the first is how will shared vehicles work in the event of a natural disaster where people have to quickly evacuate, like a wildfire, tsunami, or earthquake?
Well, what I think is that's a good example of why we need to start looking at these new technologies, acknowledging that they're coming. It's not a case of we're going to stop them from coming, but identifying exactly those kinds of edge use cases that are so important. I'm less worried about how shared vehicles are going to handle it and more worried about how connected autonomous vehicles are going to be handling it, because I'm worried into that same natural event when everyone's trying to get out of here that the communication network went down. And so if our connected autonomous vehicle is relying on that to get people out of here safely, and it doesn't have that cellular network. So what we need to do when we're thinking about safe and smart corridors that we're building is think about resiliency as well. What are the fallback communication networks that we're going to build so that doesn't happen? What do we build into the vehicle itself from a fallback standpoint? So if it loses that connectivity, it's still able to do that. I'm also a little bit more worried about the autonomous vehicles in the interim stage. Eventually, when we get to what we call in the industry, and we never should have done this, but level 5 or full autonomy, where I can just get my car and say, drive me from point A to the top of this mountain, and it'll be able to do that. We're probably decades away from that true full automation, but we're already having manufacturers that want to introduce cars that don't have a steering wheel and don't have pedals. So what's that car going to do in the case of that emergency? Well, we have to start asking these questions. And again, this is where policy needs to be put into place from day one to address not just the day-to-day operations that we've been talking about here, where everything works great, but those kinds of worst case scenario. Picture the worst case scenario, let's figure out the solution and make the technology guys figure it out.
Really quickly, I think that this is where equity is an issue. We assume everybody has a car. So what do people, if there's a natural disaster and they own a car, how do they evacuate? I think you have a better chance when you have an on-demand service that can come get you and understands the system, makes the evacuation routes and get people out of here. So if you have a car, you're going to get in your car and you're going to head out of Dodge, you're going to avoid the situation. But if you don't have a car, that's where I think the technology is going to help. We just got to figure out how to make sure that the system is equitable for all people.
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because that's probably what the questioner was asking about, is if I've given up my car and I'm trusting solely on shared, how is that going to get me out of here? So we have to then figure out evacuation plans that brings our transit agency in and says, using that automated vehicle that's going to come pick you up, it's going to bring you to a place where we load them up on buses and then ship them out. And in the Hurricane Katrina, the transit agencies all around the region sent buses down there. But we need to plan all of that stuff ahead, especially as we start to implement these new technologies. So that's a great question.
Yeah, great question. And we are on time. So we have, each of you have about 3 minutes for this next question. Given your experience, what are two of the most important things that we as the region should be preparing for? And if possible, can you talk about it in both an rural and rural sense? And I'll start with you, Rima.
Well, not to be redundant, but planning is key, and a lot of, unfortunately, decision makers think planning is kind of a fluff thing we do. It's often a target of budget cuts. But the precision of planning is so critical, especially when we're entering disruptive times. Because of these innovations that are great, they're disruptive. All these questions, these edge cases can become very real for a lot of people in the worst time if we haven't thoroughly planned for how we're going to handle these situations. Redundancy and resiliency can't be underrated. But I also think that as we plan, we have to utilize those plans better in making investment decisions. Oftentimes there's a departure between what we plan for and what ultimately gets funded or prioritized, and at least at the state level in terms of investments. And so I think it's kind of important that we all remind our state lawmakers as we go after funding to make sure that our regional plans, our local plans, and of course our state plans are in sync and are, capturing a vision that really supports each other and sends the same message to lawmakers that helps them connect the dots on where the critical investments need to be made. And that's particularly critical in rural areas. The urban areas are well on their way. They've got a tax base and a population that they are much more adept at planning and so to speak, taking care of themselves in some way. But we really have to pay attention to 3/4 of our state that's rural. And what are we doing about that? And what are we doing to make sure that resiliency is a priority there and that we're investing to make sure we don't leave communities stranded, that we don't face unintended consequences as we're on this mad dash to the shiny new thing. So I think I would just stress the importance of planning and coordination among jurisdictions. And I say that as the commission gets ready to update the state's 20-year transportation plan next year. We're going to be coming to you guys and MPOs across the state and cities and counties to build the next 20-year vision and update that as we think about the big law changes that have happened in our state with the Equity Justice HEAL Act, with the Climate Commitment Act. These are making huge shifts. And then the revenue package that passed the legislature this year that really saw the legislature make a hard turn towards really reprioritizing where they're investing and how. And so we know there's a lot of work there to continue that momentum. So I would say that's one thing, but it's a lot of things. And it's making sure our plans are well done and coordinated.
Great, thank you, Michael. Next.
Yeah, I agree with Rima. That was on my notes. Better planning. I just put them down. But if you think about it, if you love the way Spokane is today, it's because you have good planning. What's happening is technology is advancing like this. And so then how are you going to leverage that technology? Because there's limited funding. So you got to work on the right things. And I say this, there's 3 phases of WOW of any project. You ever heard of the 3 phases of WOW? The first phase is, wow, they finally got it under construction. Because it takes so long, we're going to build a tunnel. Well, what took you so long? You finally got it under construction. Second phase of wow is, wow, they finally finished because there's dust. It takes a long time. But here's the real key. What I loved when I was working for the public sector is the third phase of wow, wow, it really works. So with good planning, you get that wow, it really works after you planning this for 30 years, because you're looking at 30 years in RTP, and you're trying to figure out what are the projects and programs that they're going to get us to nirvana. The second piece, I think, is as you organize around this future, you're going to need staff support, whether it's contracted out or it's internal. And so how do you then migrate? When I was at Caltrans, we never even heard of the term data scientist. Now they're hiring data scientists. I thought an economist was way out there, but because we had 2 economists. Anyway, because Sam Adran was one of them. He's a good friend. But anyway, so you're gonna have to figure out what is the organization that's gonna support the future, and what are the business models? Because Glenn's gonna go, oh my God, you're putting all that technology out there, not any money to maintain it, right, Glenn? Or operate it. And I want Nirvana. I just can't afford it. So we got to figure that out as well.
Yeah, so on both of these planning topics, when I talked about the first 2 revolutions and how we've been undoing some of the damage from those because it happened so fast and we weren't really planning about what some of the negative outcomes could be with either the freeway system or cars in the first place. We see ACEs coming. we can't act and pretend like this isn't happening and that's where we're going. So our call to action is to say, what do we want our cities and communities to look like in the future, and set the policy and the long range plans right now so the technology is working for us instead of designing our communities around the technology like we did the last 2 times. Another key issue right now in this, Randy was just kind of hitting on it at the very end there, is training and workforce needs. All of this autonomous connected stuff, the intelligent transportation, that's really exciting. That's what Glenn needs to build some of the supporting infrastructure here. City transportation network does. Who's going to maintain that new equipment? This is not the same level of skills that our signal technicians or somebody who poured concrete before have. This becomes IT types of jobs that we've got to have. Glenn's already having a hard time filling staff needs as it is, and we barely start to scratch the surface of some of the stuff. So understanding that and beginning the planning of the workforce and training needs. And then I think one other main thing is, and I'll probably kind of repeat myself on some of these other questions later, but pilot projects, like this new technology is coming so fast, we can't just let it happen to us. Let's start with small, limited, controlled test beds and say, okay, stop. What did we just learn for the last 6 months? And now we're going to go into a bigger demonstration phase, but you have these new set of rules and we have a new set of performance metrics. Okay, stop. Now, before we go and actually deploy this citywide, we've gone through these other earlier gates and working with the private sector in a way that we haven't before. So those are my main points here.
Yeah, what I'm going to say is not far from what was already been said. Is the 2 things I had were planning and operating together and existing and future workforce needs. And with that planning and operating together, it's being proactive versus reactive. And that's what I feel we are today, is we're reactive. An example of that is that we have a car industry out there that says, hey, state governments, how come you're not, putting these devices up so we can operate our facilities? And then we put up devices and then they change to 5G. And so we've all got to get this, get on the same page. But with that is with every project, we should be thinking about smart, connected facilities, for the city, for the county, so that it is a multimodal network. We shouldn't just think one-dimensional with that. And the other is the investment in training and workforce. Today and the future is about operating that system efficiently, and you can't just throw somebody into this. I am not an expert, but when my staff comes to me and starts talking about this gobbledygook about how this connects, they've just gone over my head and it moves that fast. And so we need to be building that workforce today so that they are there and not on the job training. And that's where most of it comes today.
One of the things the commission has recommended the legislature, and we work closely with the Challenge Seattle group that's led by former Governor Chris Gregoire, we're seeing the emergence of mega regions around the world and in the US. For the Central Puget Sound, it's basically Vancouver, British Columbia down to just south of Portland. It's a mega region that's crossing state borders and international borders, if you can imagine. And the thinking around planning has got to expand beyond our jurisdiction, so to speak, and start looking across those borders about the bigger transportation system and proactively planning for the future we want, as opposed to reacting to what we get. And I would say that that's probably happening over in the Spokane area with Idaho. You're going to see these populations. Your population is exploding over here. What you're going to see emerge are problems that you've never had. And so the better the region can plan collectively with your neighbors and thinking about that mega region perspective into the future is going to be critical to the success of how you build your system going forward collectively.
Thanks, Rima. Great message. We have a little time for questions. Anyone? David, I think you've got one online.
I've got one more online question. So you say that Spokane has a number of advantages working in its favor to be a location for demonstration and controlled pilots of transportation technology. And so what projects, in the opinion of the panelists, might carry the most value to move the region, the state, and the nation forward in a mutually beneficial way?
Randy's got the mic, go ahead.
I got the mic. Jordan Alexander's here. Jordan is the AWS account manager for this agency, your agency. And he loves to do proof of concepts. Typically, we're not in search, now I've got my AWS hat on, sorry, AWS hat on. We're not in search, we don't have a solution in search of a problem. What we want to do is work backwards from what you think are your major issues. And so when somebody asks me a question, hey, do you have something that can help us? Well, yeah, we have a lot of things, but what is top of mind for you? I mean, we just can't guess. And so that's what I love about transitioning over to the private side is I walk in and say, I'm not a hammer in search of a nail. What are your top of mind issues? I don't have a predetermined solution for a problem that hopefully you have. And so if it's intersection safety, the high fatality rate, or different types, you have a problematic congested area, we can do analysis. I mean, there's a whole host of, we have over 200 different technologies, but we have thousands of partners that we can bring to bear on your problems, and we love doing proof of concepts. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I'd like to have the finances that come with that and be a part of the proof of concepts.
Sure.
I would just add to that, this really isn't an answer, but it's every project. You've heard us all say that every project needs to look at that. And what I mean really by that is that we all need to put as agencies and private industry investments into this. It's not going away. So let's all share those resources together. And that's one of the things that I sit on the SRTMC, the Spokane Regional Traffic Management Center Operations Board, and we have limited funding, but we are doing things together. So for example, when a project comes about and the signal system by Amazon that just built that huge building and they put in the signal at Hayford and Geiger, well, the county wanted to connect to it. We could have just said as WashDOT, build your own fiber, but that's foolish. All they had to do, don't listen to this regional administrator. We went underneath the limited access right away and connected it to our fiber. They needed one strand to be able to bring that information back. That is working together, for a project, right? And that's what we're doing is, as WashDOT, we're opening up our stuff. So we have data collection devices that all of our agencies, STA, MPO, they can all get to that information. All they have to do is ask.
So I want to come back to a point you mentioned earlier, Glenn, about complete streets and the idea of safe, smart, complete streets, right? Just adding those words in there starts to get you thinking about this as an and, not an or. And so the complete streets are not, we want to build this street to make it more pedestrian friendly and bike friendly. So therefore, we don't want to move people efficiently or safely through there. Like, always be looking at this as and. How do I move my cars efficiently and safely through here? What are some of the pilots? I'm starting to bike. I've got an e-bike now. I'm starting to bike a lot more in my town. And I know the streets that I feel really safe on that have separation from high-speed traffic and good bike lane. If we're really successful at bringing in more scooters and bikes and e-bikes, all of a sudden we're going to have a different set of issues of how do we manage that different speed vehicles that are now in that lane. So I think when you're running these pilot projects, one of the key things to think about is don't just treat each one of these as a little silo and what am I going to learn just from scooters? Like, how do I start to look at those safe, smart, complete streets and think about all of this evolution? And again, it comes back to this stuff is coming. What do we want our city and our community to look like? Let's make that technology work for us.
Thanks, everyone. All right, just raise your hand if you have a question, folks. We're gonna move on to the next question if I don't see any more, or for the panelists. So looking ahead, what policy changes should we be considering to advance some of these technology-based initiatives that you've all spoken about today? How do we get them prioritized, and how do we keep the funding up to do that? So Rima, I'll turn it to you.
So I think we have a couple slides, but I'll start by saying that money makes everything go and the lack of money stops everything. So while we talk about these things and it's exciting and necessary, the worry is that when we look long-term at our foundational funding streams for transportation, both nationally and in state, it is severely at risk as we do the right things, which is trying to get off of fossil fuel, right? Trying to save money, trying to think about how we move in a less impactful way. So that's all great, but we have a historical traditional system that's based on encouraging the consumption of gas to pay for our infrastructure. So when the legislature is wrestling with all these competing demands and the fact that we're at least $500 million a year behind in our maintenance investments alone, it's hard to get them to think about shoveling money out for things that feel like it's way off. We can worry about that later. Our roads are falling apart right now. We've got highways going to gravel in parts of our state. We've got bridges that are ready to drop. So, you know, it's kind of a reset on prioritization. And so for us, the funding is critical to solving that long-term sustainability issue in order so we can shift our focus to these important topics of it actually advancing our system as opposed to just keeping our nose above water. So I just want to touch quickly a little bit on the road usage charge work we've been doing because it is all about moving away from reliance on the consumption of gas. You can go to the next slide. The problem we're facing is really in this chart, is what got the legislature worried, I would say, and triggered an assessment on road charging. It started a decade ago, so we've been really deep diving into this topic. But what you can see here on this chart is if you take our state's current MPG of 20 miles per gallon, and our state forecasters conservatively estimate we're going to go to 35 miles per gallon on average by 2035. We think we're going to get there sooner than that. You know, we see a 71% increase in miles per gallon, which equates to a 42% decline on cents per mile in our core funding for our transportation system. Those are dollars that are dedicated right now to the 18th Amendment to roads and bridges and highway purposes. That is not an insignificant problem. And so when we look at how we're going to solve for that, and waiting is not an option because you can't flip a paradigm overnight. We've got to start slow. We've got to ease into it. You can go to the next slide. We have to understand the problem. And it's not an issue of CAFE standards or federal or state policy that's pushing this. It is just pure innovation and technology that, for again, all the right reasons is happening. But you take a Toyota Camry of 2009, these are both gas-powered vehicles, it's not a hybrid, and they were getting 25 miles per gallon, paid about $198 a year in state fuel tax. Today, that same car gets 52 miles per gallon, and they're paying $95 a year in state fuel tax. And that's just an average car, right? A fuel car. We won't even get into hybrids and electrics. So that really accelerates the problem. So on the next slide, this kind of really plots the issue we're facing, which is the gas tax was structured on a foundation that everyone paid and everyone benefited. It was pretty simple and it's worked for a long time because we all were kind of driving the same kind of cars, got the same kind of gas mileage. There wasn't a lot of choices for consumers. But with the emergence of technology, alternative fuels, coupled with climate policies and objectives that are emerging nationally and in each state, it's kind of moved to a system now where some people are paying, but everybody's benefiting. And as that pool of the payers decreases, that burden for paying shifts to them as well. And those tend to be people driving inefficient vehicles, fuel inefficient vehicles, and low income. So I can afford to move into an EV, other people can't. They're the ones shouldering that burden, and we fall further and further behind. This chart really just shows that if you're falling in that blue quadrant that's getting under 20 miles per gallon today, you could be paying as much as 5 or 6 cents a mile today under the gas tax. You can do the math and figure out what you're paying. And if you're getting over 20, you could be paying as little as a penny a mile or nothing using the same road. So I think there's one more slide. I'm not sure. Yep. That one, the other question people often ask us is, why can't we just keep raising the gas tax? Because our legislature likes to do that. They've done it pretty successfully a few times in the recent past. And we're happy for that. It's a short-term fix. But what we know is between now and 2040, just to keep our nose above water, they'd have to raise the gas tax 1.7 cents per year, every year between now and 2040. And that does not factor in inflation. So what we end up is in 2040, we've got almost $1 per gallon gas tax that maybe, let's just say 10% of the vehicle owners are paying, and our system falls further behind. So not a solution. And thus pushing the need to move over to a system that does not rely on people consuming any kind of fuel, because we don't want to pick that horse in that race, because it could be electric, could be hydrogen fuel cell, could be a lot of things. So rather, let's focus on usage of the road and paying for what you use. I think that's it. That's just the website, but I just want to kind of stress that and plant that seed. We would love to continue talking with you about this because we really feel it is the foundational issue that poses the biggest threat to us getting to move forward on any of these other issues.
So policy changes, the first, I would challenge the directors to create an environment of innovation. I don't know if any of you are directors here, I'm gonna look at you, but when I was at the Country House Transportation Authority, my board, we didn't have any ramp meters, we didn't have any technology in the county. We ended up having meters on every, except for Interstate 680, which they're doing. We tested all kinds of different technologies. And the board came back to the staff and said, you need to hurry up. People are trying to pass you. And so it became, and you're not going to be successful every single time, but you learn more from failure than you do from success. And so I challenged the board to create an environment of innovation and applaud staff when they take risks, because if you don't, they're not going to take any risks and you're not going to reach this nirvana stage. I think two is, you're going to use your shoulders differently. You're going to require changes potentially in federal funding, because when I used to go to Washington, DC, I said, in California, 12% of the transportation dollars from the federal government from excise tax, 18.4 cents. About 23% of the dollars comes from the state excise tax on gasoline, which is like around 56 cents, or lower 50 cents. The majority of the money comes from sales tax or local. But when we go to Washington, DC, they keep adding on regulations, which tend to cost more money. So you do less of a project because you have more regulations. And so I think streamline some of the regulations to streamline the project delivery project to save money is a good thing. And so those are some of the things that I would suggest, and that I've done actually in my career, is talk a little bit about regulation reform, and then also to create an environment of innovation. I think that's an easy one to do.
So picking up on that, part of that environment of innovation is encouraging and allowing your staff to take some of those risks and understanding that the only pilot that's actually a failure is if you don't learn anything from it. So the other part of it is creating sort of the infrastructure from a procedure and process standpoint to allow private sector to innovate here as well. And so creating the structure to both encourage specific pilots that you want to achieve your outcomes, and also open the door for private sector that wants to come along with ideas and say, okay, you can't just do that on our streets unless you do it in this manner. Here's the pilot phase, here's how long. I talked about that a little bit earlier. I think one of the other big policy changes that is going to be coming to our cities is the way we manage our curbs. We talked about connected, we talked about autonomous, we're looking at all those different form factors of vehicles. We've seen a massive shift in the way that people get their goods, and we're seeing a lot more their Amazon's parent company shipping boxes to our houses and to our businesses. We need to think about how we manage our curbs differently. Now, the good news is that's also an extremely valuable asset that the city and the municipalities have to both through carrot and stick, and mostly hopefully carrot, encourage the kind of behavior and the kind of curb use they want to do. But in cities, I'm not sure what the parking payment policy is here, but I know Portland and many other cities that have relied very heavily on parking revenue in the past have the same kinds of fears at the local municipal level that the DOT has around, for different reasons, obviously. But when that level of parking, if you're really getting picked up and dropped off by autonomous shuttles, you're not parking anymore, but the curb is used for different purposes. So start to envision what that future looks like in all these different scenarios. And again, start to put the policies in place to have the outcomes you want instead of letting the technology happen to us.
Great answers. Question from the audience. Okay.
So, I mean, this is clearly an auto-centric conversation, but when we talk about decarbonization, efficiency, cost, health benefits, I mean, where's bikes in this conversation? And why aren't we investing more in that? Or are we, and I'm just not seeing it?
Well, that wasn't really the framework of what we were asked to come and talk about, but it's one of the reasons that I was saying and not or. So all of this conversation shouldn't be about how do we move cars more efficiently and safely, and how do we support this connected autonomous vehicle. We should be looking at these safe, smart, complete streets. And bikes and peds have to be part of that future. And that's why we need to think about it as an and, not an or. And if we do want to talk, I mean, if we want to talk about how are we going to get the most environmental benefits, we need to be not even talking about a lot of these technologies, talking about bikes, whether they're e-bikes or regular bikes, and encourage that kind of investment. But let's again do it in a complete street design that is thinking about all of these factors together.
So real quick, I come from the Bay Area, so we invest in, again, CCTA now, where we invest millions of dollars in bike and pedestrian. And what we like to separate bike and pedestrian facilities, because if you think in terms of the fatality rate in the United States, the highest percentage increase is pedestrians. And your cars are way smarter today than they were in 2005. The fatality rate is still around 40,000 people killed in the United States. And that was back in the 2005, and I'm old, so I mean, I remember way back when. But those cars in 2005 today are way smarter. They have automated advanced driver assistance systems, collision avoidance systems. They tell you if they're going to crash. They set the car up for a collision. So we're distracted. And so what we're trying to do is utilize technology to make those, because you have hotspots here. I don't know where they are, but you have hotspots where you have these aggregations of collision crashes. And we have technology partners that come in and take a look at what's the causalities of those crashes and try to avoid them. Using artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can start predicting where you're going to have collisions. So that is part and parcel along this technology discussion, which I apologize for not talking about earlier. But bike and peds, I mentioned walking across the street. I can't make it across the street, but it'll hold that green light longer for you. That's technology today to make sure, because people want to walk still. And people want to ride bicycles, but they want to be safe. And if you're in the public sector, you want them to be safe. Glenn's job is to make sure that I'm safe when I walk across that street. And I think he's very good at it.
Thank you.
All right, one more question, just time for one more.
So about innovation, do you see the US DOT, the elephant in the room here, helping with that or not?
Yes, so I think it's incumbent upon the public agency to understand what those opportunities are. So FTA has a sandbox you can apply. They have a lot of, so I call it the bipartisan infrastructure law bill, or IIJA, $1.2 trillion. You got $550 billion of competitive grants, or money, new money that's largely going to be competitive grants, $650 billion, which is an increase because it increases it by local bridge, and there's a local bridge program. There's another program in there. So that's more money that when I was still at Caltrans, I spent a lot more money that I have to allocate within those five-year term. But they're challenging agencies like this one to work with the others to come up with grant proposals. So there's a city on the other side, is there a mountain between us and Bellevue? Yeah, on the other side of the Cascades is Bellevue, Washington. And so what they're trying to do is go vision zero. They don't want any more fatalities. So they've adopted more of a Scandinavian approach. They're going to want more people to walk. They're going to have 2 new light rail stations. How do we prepare for that? To make sure when you want to, because you're not going to want to drive there and park and pay $90 where it's the cost to park there when you take off.
That's why I don't go to Bellevue anymore.
But there is a lot of money available for innovations. So what you have to do is go after those dollars. And typically it's not a public agency, but it's a partnership that you put together. So absolutely, there's opportunities for opportunity.
I tell you that Bellevue has some of the greatest technology use for bikes detection. It's awesome. I just wish I had their budget every year. It's amazing. But what I would say is that, remember I mentioned the SR27 Pines corridor where we had some connected devices, the dedicated short range radio that came from the US DOT that said, look, the auto industry is pounding our door saying, DOTs, you're not doing enough. So they provided a pot of money that allowed us to go invest in that and get it up and running. So it's one small example. And then what happened is industry kind of changed their direction. And we still have those units and we can use them for other things like the pedestrian, signals that were there, but we're not using them for the vehicles. So they did step up in that case, but there's a lot more. Yeah.
So we didn't used to use USDOT and innovation in the same sentence unless it was a negative connotation. They did this Smart Cities Challenge a few years ago where they had $50 million and a bunch of other sort of cash and prizes, as I used to call it, and all cities had to compete for this. City of Columbus ended up winning it, and part of their response was, we've got both the state DOT, city DOT, and a whole bunch of private businesses around here are putting in match money into this. So we're gonna take your $50 million and turn it into a couple $100 million and do this smart cities program. The DOT said, wow, they learned a ton of lessons from that. What Randy's talking about is, ever since then, the funding grant opportunities that they're putting out, they're actually kind of expecting you to come and say, we're asking for this much money, but we're bringing these technology and innovation partners along with us, and they're helping match that. So we're gonna double the investment that you make in this. They used to force us, like, it used to be a no-no to bring a private sector partner into that. You had to go through the competitive procurement process, right? So give me my money and then I'll follow. And they're realizing the competitive procurement process doesn't keep pace with the innovations that are happening in the industry right now, and we're getting a lot more bang for our buck. So we actually are starting to see them being far more innovative than they used to be.
Thanks, everyone. We are right on time. You are A students. We are exactly at our last question here. We're about 12 or 13 minutes to finish up. But in light of all the things you've already talked about, all of our partners are here in the room. How does the NPO help advance these initiatives in other ways that maybe we haven't addressed already? And I see Randy grabbed his mic, so I'll let him go.
So thank you for the question. So I think NPOs many years ago were designed because they represent, I remember, how many cities or towns do you have? 14, so we had 19. But so in the MTC region in the Bay Area, there's 101 cities and counties. And so it's a large region there. But the NPOs were set up to kind of represent the cities and work with the cities and the counties to make sure that you have a unified front. And I think sometimes we don't spend enough time looking back in history to learn from what are we doing and how are we doing it. And so I think that partnerships are very, very important, and that's NPOs. And so I think that you're in a great position to help make sure that these things happen in the future, as long as you can see it. And then once you can see it, then you can start planning for it. And I think you'll be better off. I don't want to harp on proof of concepts, but there's opportunities at an NPO level to partner with the private sector where your procurement rules may be a little bit different than some others. I know that in my case, if I could convince my board that this was a good allocation of dollars, we didn't, even if there weren't any federal dollars in it, that we could actually go out and sole source those contracts or sole source or form a partnership to test something. So I think the NPOs are in really good shape to do that. And then the last thing, I didn't mention this before, but what's going to happen in the future, I think, and you're going to like this, is when as the ability to store data is the cost of storing data is going down. So as you gather data for your region, you're going to be able to start building models. You're going to build a digitized model of this region here. And then what you're going to end up doing is you're going to twin that model, and you're going to start messing up the twin. So the manufacturing, so GE builds a new jet engine, they build a model, they twin the model, and they mess the model up. If it works, then they make the adjustments on the model and they go back into production. Think about innovation and think about the ability to data store and model. You can actually mess up Spokane in a model on the twin. It doesn't hurt anybody. And then if it works, then you go implement it and you save your job, just in case if the directors don't want to build this environment for innovation, and they're kind of sticky still. And so there's opportunities for the NPOs to use technology to fail fast without failing in public, and then determine whether or not these adjustments should occur.
I would, along those lines, I think NPOs in Washington State, it's been demonstrated over and over that an important role of an NPO is to facilitate a collective vision for the region. So it's like a microcosm of knitting together everybody's priorities and interests, and hopefully coming up with a vision and a plan that carries the region forward. But again, we can't live in a vacuum and think about just our region, or just our city, or just our state for that matter. And so you got to do well here, but always remember what's around you and try to embrace and partner with them as well. When we talk about these federal grant opportunities, that it's out there, it's on the table now, there's a lot of money that everybody can go after. But what we hear over and over when we go into localities is it costs a lot of money and time to go after those dollars, those grant dollars, that a lot of cities and counties don't have resources to pursue. And if they're lucky enough to get those dollars, it takes a lot of resources and staff to administer those programs. Comes with a lot of red tape and strings. So what I would encourage, again, along this idea of working together, partnering together, is finding ways, as you go after those grant dollars, do them collectively, build partnerships with private sector partners. Excuse me, and be prepared, have a plan for if we're successful, how are we gonna deliver? And help the smaller cities succeed, because they're not gonna do it on their own, and there's a lot of dollars out there that can help them.
I think I'd add to that, the discussion that we've already had about planning and data partnerships. And so the SRTMC, the Spokane Regional TMC, our Traffic Management Center, is comprised of Spokane Valley, Spokane County, STA, our transit, and WashDOT and the MPO. And the importance of that is that we are a small group focused on operating the system better, but we're all different, and we're all coming together to do this. And so what that means is that while we might be different, without our leaders of each of our agencies embracing this and moving this, we're not gonna move the needle. It's gonna stay where it's at. So that's the first thing I would share with the MPOs is figure out a way that we can all get on the same bus. That's multimodal. The second is, in that same thing is a grant request. If we could have grant requests that include some technology component to advance efficiency for all modes, that's a big lift. But bikes, pets, transit, okay, let's just not think about vehicles, right? So what can we do with that? And then the last thing, this is where audience participation, you've all been way too quiet. So I need you to raise your hands now for a question. How many of you seen the movie Smokey and the Bandit? Okay, I've seen it, right? I love that movie. There's like 27 of them, right? Kind of like Rocky. There's a song in there and it says, we have a long way to go and a short time to get there. Okay. What I gathered from that, and when that came to my mind as I was thinking about this question, is that we need to invest today to get to the future today. We have a long way to go and we can't sit around and wait for it. We got a long way to go and a short time to get there. So let's put that hammer down like he did and obviously not break the laws, of course.
So I don't want to be too repetitive, so I'll try not to be, but I'm glad the issue was brought up about bikes, because thinking multimodal, as we've talked about here, has to be part of that future vision. And it needs to be and not or with all these things. The role that you guys have, I think, is reach out to your community, do a lot of outreach, like kind of scare them a little bit about what this crazy future looks like, because it is coming, and say, what do we want our communities to look like? How can we make this stuff work for us so our streets and our city is designed and that stuff works for us instead of designing it around the technology? And really think about the equity piece of what that means. We didn't do that in those first two revolutions. We didn't ask all communities, and we didn't care. And in some cases, we maybe, I'm not going to go there. We have had detrimental effects on a lot of communities. We have a chance to kind of at least get it right. What works for the Spokane region is going to look totally different than what works for Seattle and look different than what works for the Bay Area. That's not just okay, that's the way it should be. But reach out to your communities and find out what they want their communities to look like, and then set the policies to make all this stuff that we were talking about work within that.
Thank you very much. All right, folks. Do we have any final questions? We do. Okay, make it my way. I don't wear heels all the time, so don't slip.
Kind of to come across a few of the points that you guys made. You talked about regulation versus innovation and how regulation stifles innovation. And innovation doesn't happen in the governmental sector, it happens in the private sector. So how do you propose we get deregulated enough that we can allow private industry to feel more confident in aligning with some of the things that you'd like to see done so that some of the money can flow in, because the red tape that Rima talked about, where the private industry, that money is kind of hard to get to sometimes because of the regulations. How do you get past and then start deregulating?
So the regulatory framework that I was mentioning I didn't mention innovation and lack of innovation regulation reform. Regulation reform, on the federal dollar, it keeps stacking more regulations on it, which then takes more time because you have to check more boxes, which tends to cost you more money. We used to have to hire a person just to go to study the reimbursement, because the federal program is a reimbursement program. I hired a person just to look at making sure the invoices would get reimbursed. So in order to get money, I had to hire a person to get the money, which makes no sense to me. I mean, if I send the bill in, pay me my money, but I gotta hire a person to make sure that the bill is in the right location. So that's a problem for me. But on the innovation side, I think this is where the public sector excels, is on the regulation side. They set the regulation, not the public sector. And when they set regulations properly, it spurs innovation. So it doesn't necessarily have to come solely from the public sector and or the private sector. There are very innovative NPOs in the country that are doing some cool things. Why? Because they have this framework, maybe the regulatory framework within the admin manual allows them to innovate. And so don't cut the public sector short on innovation ever, because you've got some really innovative people there trying to refine their regulatory framework. But when they work together, the other piece I was saying is ask for help, leverage the private sector and the resources that they have, and you might really enjoy that partnership. And that's in California, we have to pass special legislation to create public-private partnerships. I don't think you have a lot of forbids public-private partnerships in Washington.
You have one that enables it,
See?
they had a moratorium until 2 years ago.
So, but these regulations that the
Yeah.
public sector can help, they spur that innovation, and then the sky's the limit.
Yeah, I might add to what Randy said. So I'm going to give a boots on the ground example, and I didn't share this earlier when we talked about the ramp meters. So boots on the ground, innovation, deregulation, without asking. That's my tagline here, so to speak. So when we put those ramp meters together, we did ask our partners, City of Spokane primarily, and we said, look, what do you need out of this? And they said, we don't want your traffic backing up onto our facility. And we said, whoa, time out. Okay, it's your traffic coming to our facility that's causing the problem. So we flipped the table. So then we said, what if we could make those ramp meters operate two ways? They operate off of I-90 flows, and they are primarily not for I-90. So these meters now think, so to speak. So if I-90 is light and the ramp meter is building up at Division, for example, it will talk to the next ramp meter or over the next ramp meter, and it'll say, hey, you only have 2 cars sitting in at your spot. I have 10. I need some more space on the system. And what it does then is it retards the flow rate, holds those cars back, builds a few extra so Division can get on. And then we have not only adaptive, which is adapted to the flows of I-90, we have traffic responsive, which that goes into when there's certain conditions, meters go to a certain thing that we have put together for scenarios. So we've made these smarter, not just on, off, get on the freeway. That's adaptive, innovative deregulation in my book, because then I told my regional administrator what we were doing, and he said, can you do that? And I said, well, show me where I can't do that. So he gives me latitude and keeps me out of jail. I appreciate it.
How badly do you want to end right on time, or can I go 2 minutes over?
I think you can go a minute or two. I know we got to get some people on some flights, so one more
Okay.
minute.
So I'm going to use the scooter example, because we saw these across the country and we saw very different responses. They sort of just parachuted in to San Diego and certain cities. People woke up and they're like, what the heck are these? They're all over our city. And there was no regulation yet. So they're like, hey, we can just do this. Or there wasn't clear regulation or whatever. And then a whole bunch of other cities said, no go, like you just can't even come here. And so their version of regulation was, we're not even experimenting with. So what Portland did, and it was a model of, we keep talking about a culture of innovation and pilot projects and demonstrations. They said, you can come in for a limited period of time in this neighborhood, but we're we're gonna let you go in downtown, because I know that's where you want to go, but you're also gonna have to come over to this other neighborhood that we don't think you would serve. You're gonna have 6 months, we're gonna capture a whole bunch of data, we're gonna see how our citizens feel, and you're gonna stop. And then we're gonna come back into a demonstration phase with everything that we learned from that and set new rules and turn this into a 1-year pilot. You're gonna be able to go year round. We're gonna expand the footprint, but again, we're gonna equity focus and make sure that you're in the places you want to be and in the places that you might not choose to serve. And then you got 1 year and then stop. And now we can actually set policy around the outcomes we're trying to achieve here. And so instead of the heavy-handed regulation of you're just not doing this at all, or the unregulation of just throw them wherever you want, this is what developing a culture of innovation and pilot and demonstration projects allows you to do with private sector. So it's one example.
Thanks, Adrian. How about a round of applause for our panelists? So Rima, Adrian, Randy, we really appreciate you coming all the way out here to educate us all and give us some great ideas. So safe travels, everybody. Thanks for coming.